Miss Marple and 5 Glasses of Silence.
Chapter 1. The Silence at Windermoor Cottage. The morning in St. Mary Mead unfolded with a quiet gentleness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the village itself had decided to remain undisturbed for a little while longer. A pale mist hovered just above the hedgerows, softening the edges of cottages and gardens, while the narrow lane beyond Miss Marple's window lay still and empty beneath the early light. Somewhere in the distance, a gate clicked shut, followed by the faint rattle of a cart and the cheerful call of a blackbird perched upon a low stone wall. Miss Marple had just finished her breakfast. The small tray before her was arranged with her usual neatness: a slice of toast carefully buttered, a jar of orange marmalade, and a blue china cup, now nearly empty, of tea. She dabbed her lips lightly with her napkin, and then folded it with quiet precision before setting it aside. Reaching for her little diary, she glanced over the day's modest notes. Nothing particularly urgent, nothing that would trouble most people. Yet, as she closed the diary, she paused. "There is something," she murmured softly, almost to herself. It was not a thought exactly, more a faint feeling, like a thread one could not quite see, but could sense all the same. It had come to her the previous evening, and lingered still, gentle but persistent. After a moment, she looked toward the mantel clock. "Yes," she said calmly, rising from her chair. "I think I shall go and see Sophia." Sophia Hadley was an old friend, one of those rare companions with whom one did not need frequent visits or constant conversation in order to maintain a steady understanding. She lived at Windermoor Cottage, a somewhat aging house at the far end of the village, where ivy crept generously across the front walls, and the garden had long since surrendered its neatness to a more natural disorder. Miss Marple had not seen her for several days, and though that was not unusual, the quiet unease she now felt seemed reason enough to pay a visit. She dressed with her usual simplicity, grey shawl, sensible hat, walking stick, and stepped out into the morning. The village, she noticed at once, was unusually still. There was no gardener trimming hedges near the vicarage, no maid polishing brass at Rosebank House, no voices drifting from open kitchen windows. Even the baker's boy, who was often seen darting through the lanes with unnecessary enthusiasm, was nowhere in sight. Miss Marple walked on slowly, observing without appearing to do so. Quiet, she thought, was not always peace. Windermoor Cottage stood at the end of a narrow path lined with lavender bushes and rather neglected rose shrubs. The ivy on its walls had grown thick and untidy, and one of the upper shutters hung slightly askew. None of that was remarkable. Sophia had often remarked that Harold disliked spending money unless absolutely required. Miss Marple reached the front door and rang the bell. She waited. No answer came. After a moment she rang again, this time a little longer. Still nothing. That, she thought, was rather curious. Windermoor Cottage was not a silent household. There was usually some movement within: Sophia in the drawing room, Lydia on the stairs, Robert crossing the hall, or Martha the maid moving briskly from one room to another with trays and cloths. Miss Marple rang the bell a third time, then paused, listening carefully. No footsteps, no voice, no sound of any kind. She reached out and tried the handle. The door opened at once. Miss Marple did not start. Startling, she had long ago decided, was seldom useful. Instead, she stood quietly on the threshold, looking into the hall with calm attention. The house was open, but it did not feel awake. There was a faint smell in the air, orange, certainly, but stronger than it ought to have been, and beneath it something heavier, less pleasant, as though food had been left out too long. A chair in the hall stood at an odd angle. One of Harold's umbrellas lay on the floor beside the stand. Further in, just beyond the archway, she could see part of a tray lying tipped upon the carpet. Miss Marple stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "Mrs. Hadley," she called gently. "Sophia, dear?" No reply came. She moved forward into the drawing room and stopped. The tray had fallen. A glass lay on its side, its contents dried into a sticky stain upon the polished floor. A plate had slipped halfway beneath a small table, and one cushion from the sofa rested awkwardly on the carpet, as though disturbed and forgotten. But it was not the disorder that held her attention. Mr. Harold Hadley lay near the hearthrug, his body stretched at an uncomfortable angle, one arm bent beneath him. Not far from him, Edwin Hadley, his younger brother, lay similarly motionless, his head turned toward the doorway and one hand half curled as though it had been reaching for something. Miss Marple crossed the room at once with surprising quickness. She bent over Harold first. He was breathing, shallow but steady. She moved to Edwin. He too was alive. "Oh, that is something," she said softly. Without delay, she went through into the dining room. There, the scene was stranger still. Sophia sat slumped in her chair, her head resting back, as if sleep had overtaken her mid-sentence. Lydia leaned forward over the table, one arm hanging loosely at her side. Robert had fallen back in his seat, his face pale, his lips dry. Before them stood the remains of supper, 5 glasses, each with traces of orange liquid clinging faintly to the sides. Miss Marple moved from one to another, examining them with quiet care. All were breathing, all were deeply unconscious. She straightened slowly, her gaze lingering on the table. A meal interrupted. 5 people overcome at the same moment, no sign of struggle, no overturned chairs, no cry for help, only stillness. Her eyes returned to the glasses. Orange juice, certainly. But the scent, yes. But there it was again, stronger than it should have been, and touched with something faintly bitter. Miss Marple leaned slightly closer, not touching, only observing. Then she straightened once more. "Taken together," she murmured. "That is very curious indeed." At that moment, hurried footsteps sounded outside, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Madam?" It was Martha, the maid. She appeared in the doorway, a basket still in her hand, then froze at the sight before her. "Oh, my goodness, what has happened?" Miss Marple turned to her calmly. "They are all alive," she said, "but they have been made ill very suddenly and all at once." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. I only just came. I was not here last night." "That can be explained later," said Miss Marple, gently but firmly. "For now, you must go at once for the doctor, and inform the police." Martha hesitated only a moment before dropping her basket and running from the house. When she had gone, silence returned once more. Miss Marple stood very still in the centre of the room. Outside, the village remained as peaceful as ever. Inside Windermoor Cottage, however, something very deliberate had taken place, and Miss Marple, looking quietly at the 5 untouched glasses, knew at once that this was no accident. It was, she thought, the beginning of something far more serious. Write Chapter 2, only 900 words only, and with title, Chapter 2. A Bitter Trace. The arrival of the doctor and the police brought with it a sudden, purposeful energy that seemed almost at odds with the quiet tension that had settled over Windermoor Cottage. Within minutes, the stillness of the house was broken by footsteps, low voices, and the firm movements of men accustomed to dealing with emergencies. Dr. Hayward moved quickly from one patient to another, his brow furrowed in concentration. He checked pulses, lifted eyelids, and spoke in short, practical sentences to the constable who stood nearby, trying his best to keep up. "Breathing is stable. Pulse weak, but regular. No visible injuries," he muttered. "This is not a natural collapse." Miss Marple, standing slightly aside, watched him with calm attention. "Doctor," she said gently, "they all appear to have taken something at the same time." Dr. Hayward glanced at her. "Yes, I should say so. Quite unusual for 5 people to fall ill together without some common cause." He straightened and looked around the room, his eyes resting briefly on the glasses upon the table. "What did they have for supper?" he asked. "Something light, I imagine," Miss Marple replied. "But they all seem to have had the same drink." Dr. Hayward stepped closer to the table and examined one of the glasses. He lifted it carefully, sniffed, then frowned slightly. "Orange juice," he said, "but stronger than one might expect." Inspector Mallory arrived shortly thereafter, a solid, practical man with a habit of listening more than speaking. He removed his hat as he entered and surveyed the room with a measured glance before approaching Miss Marple. "I understand you found them." Miss Marple." "I did," she said. "Quite by chance. I'd come to call on Mrs. Hadley." He nodded. "And they were all like this?" "Yes, exactly as you see them." Inspector Mallory made a note in his book, then looked toward the doctor. "Poison?" he asked quietly. Dr. Hayward hesitated. "I cannot be certain yet, but there is something—" "Yes, something ingested. I shall have to take them to the hospital for proper examination." "Do so," said the inspector, "at once." Within a short time, arrangements were made, stretchers were brought in, and one by one the members of the Hadley household were carefully lifted and carried out. Harold first, then Edwin, followed by Sophia, Lydia, and Robert. Miss Marple stood near the doorway, watching each face as it passed. No signs of pain, no struggle, only a deep and unnatural sleep. When the last stretcher had been taken away and the doctor had departed with them, the house seemed emptier than before, emptier, and yet somehow heavier. Only Miss Marple, its Inspector Mallory, and Martha remained. Martha hovered near the hall, her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale with shock. "I don't understand, sir," she said to the inspector. "Everything was fine yesterday. I left after dinner preparations. They were all well." "You left before supper?" asked the inspector. "Yes, sir. I always leave after setting things ready. Madame prefers to serve herself in the evening." "And when you returned this morning?" "The door was open," Martha said, her voice trembling, "and Miss Marple was already inside. And they were all like this." Inspector Mallory nodded slowly, making another note. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had moved quietly back into the drawing room. She stood near the fallen tray, her eyes taking in every detail. The position of the glass, the angle of the stain on the floor, the slight disturbance of the cushion. But she did not touch anything. She merely observed. After a moment, she bent slightly, examining the edge of the glass where a faint residue remained. "Curious," she murmured. Inspector Mallory entered behind her. "You see something, Miss Marple?" "Only a small inconsistency," she said. "Nothing definite." He waited. "The glasses in the dining room," she continued, "contained only a faint trace of liquid. But this one," she gestured lightly, "seems to have had rather more left in it." Inspector Mallory frowned. "Meaning?" "Perhaps nothing at all," Miss Marple said gently. "But one might suppose that whoever drank from this glass did not finish it entirely." The inspector made a note. They moved next to the dining room. Inspector Mallory stood at the head of the table, looking down at the 5 glasses. "All drank," he said. "All collapsed. That suggests the cause is here." Yes, said Miss Marple quietly, but not necessarily in the same way. He looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. Only that when something affects several people at once, one must consider whether it was introduced before or after it was shared. Inspector Mallory considered that. You think something was added? Later? It is a possibility, she said, though I should not like to say more until we know what the doctor finds. The inspector nodded slowly. He moved toward the sideboard where a small cupboard stood slightly ajar. Inside, drawers had been pulled open. A jewellery box lay empty. Now this, he said, is something more straightforward. Miss Marple joined him. Yes, she said, it would appear that something has been taken. Martha stepped forward anxiously. Sir, Madame had jewellery in there and cash as well. I saw her take money out only yesterday. Inspector Mallory turned to her. You are certain of that? Yes, sir. I was dusting. She told Miss Lydia she had taken it from the locker. He wrote it down. A robbery, then, he said. Poisoning and theft. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she looked once more at the table, the glasses, the quiet room. Then she said very softly, Yes, that is how it appears. Inspector Mallory closed his notebook with a decisive snap. We shall have the full picture soon enough, he said, once they regain consciousness. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, she said. But as she glanced once more at the glasses, at their careful arrangement, their equal measure, she felt again that faint, persistent thread of unease. Robbery, perhaps. Poisoning, certainly. But something about it all was too neat. And Miss Marple had long ago learned that when things appeared too neat, the truth was usually hidden somewhere just beneath the surface, waiting to be quietly observed. Write Chapter 3, only 900 words only, and with title no repetition. Chapter 3. Voices in Recovery. The hospital at Market Town stood a short distance beyond the village, a modest building of pale stone with wide windows that admitted more light than comfort. By the following morning, the quiet urgency of the previous day had settled into a more controlled atmosphere, one of careful observation, whispered conversations, and the steady rhythm of recovery. Miss Marple arrived just after 10 o'clock. She had not hurried. There was, she believed, a proper time for everything, including questions. People spoke more truthfully when they were neither frightened nor rushed, and though the Hadley family had endured a serious shock, they would now be in a state where memory might return in small, useful fragments. Inspector Mallory was already there. He stood near the nurses' station, speaking quietly with Dr. Hayward, who looked considerably less anxious than he had the day before. They are all conscious, the doctor was saying. Weak, of course, and rather confused, but the danger has passed. And the cause? Asked the inspector. Dr. Hayward lowered his voice slightly. There was a sedative in their system, a fairly strong one, enough to induce unconsciousness quite rapidly. Nothing more serious? There are traces of something else, the doctor admitted. Very slight, too little to be immediately dangerous, but it suggests the drink was tampered with, perhaps more than once. Inspector Mallory's expression sharpened. More than once? It is possible, said the doctor. I would not yet call it poison in the usual sense, but it was certainly not accidental. Miss Marple, who had approached quietly, inclined her head. Thank you, doctor, she said. That is most helpful. Dr. Hayward gave her a brief, respectful nod before excusing himself. Inspector Mallory turned to her. It seems you may have been right, Miss Marple. This was no simple matter. I'm afraid not, she replied gently. They began with Sophia. She lay propped against her pillows, her face pale but composed. At the sight of Miss Marple, a faint expression of relief crossed her features. "My dear Miss Marple," she said weakly, "how very good of you to come." Miss Marple took her hand lightly. "You gave us quite a fright, Sophia, but I am glad to see you improving." Sophia managed a small smile. "I remember very little. Only that we were at dinner, and then everything seemed to fade." Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Mrs. Hadley, can you recall anything unusual, anything at all?" Sophia frowned slightly, searching her memory. "There was nothing alarming," she said slowly. "We were having a quiet supper. Edwin had brought some juice, I believe. We were speaking of his new employment." "His new job?" the inspector asked. "Yes, he had recently found work. We were rather pleased for him." Miss Marple glanced briefly at the inspector but said nothing. "Do you remember drinking the juice?" he continued. "Yes," Sophia replied. "We all had some. And then—" She hesitated. "I felt very tired, that is all." There was no more to be gained from her for the moment. They moved next to Lydia. She appeared more restless than her mother, her fingers twisting the edge of the bedsheet as though she could not quite settle. At the sight of them, she sat up slightly. "Is everyone all right?" she asked at once. They're recovering," said the inspector. "We would like to ask you a few questions." Lydia nodded quickly. "You served the drinks last night?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Edwin brought the juice and I poured it into the glasses." "Did you notice anything unusual?" "No, nothing at all," she replied at once. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. Lydia continued, her voice slightly strained. "It was just ordinary juice. I didn't add anything. I mean, there was nothing to add." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Innocent people often searched for their answers, pausing, uncertain. Lydia, however, seemed eager, almost anxious, to be understood at once. "Quite natural, I'm sure," Miss Marple said gently. "It must all seem very confusing." Lydia nodded, though her hands did not still. They left her soon after. In the next room, Robert lay staring at the ceiling, his expression distant. He turned his head slowly as they entered. Robert," said the inspector, we need to know what you remember." Robert swallowed. "Not much," he said. "We were talking about Edwin's job, then we had the juice." He paused, his brow tightening slightly. "It tasted different," he added. Miss Marple stepped a little closer. "Different in what way, my dear?" Robert hesitated. "Stronger, perhaps? I thought it was just fresh, but I don't know." "Did you finish your glass?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I think so." His voice lacked certainty. "And after that?" "I felt strange," he said quietly. "Heavy, like I couldn't move properly." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, Robert." There was something else in his manner, not fear exactly, but unease, as though he wished to say more but had decided against it. Inspector Mallory noticed it as well, but did not press further, for now. They found Harold next. He was sitting upright, looking considerably less fragile than the others, though his temper appeared intact. "This is an outrage," he declared as soon as they entered. "My own house, my own table, and this happens." Inspector Mallory remained calm. "We are investigating, Mr. Hadley." "Well, you need not look far," Harold snapped. "It is perfectly obvious." "Is it?" said the inspector evenly. "Of course it is," Harold continued. "Edwin brought the drink. Edwin served it. And now my valuables are missing." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "Suspicion is a natural thing," she said mildly, "but one must be careful not to allow it to settle too quickly." Harold frowned. "Are you suggesting he is innocent?" "I am suggesting nothing," she replied. Only that facts are often more reliable than impressions." Harold made a dismissive sound but said no more. Finally, they came to Edwin. He sat apart from the others, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze lowered. At their approach, he looked up, his expression weary but steady. "Inspector," he said quietly. "Mr. Edwin," the inspector replied. "We need your account of last night." Edwin nodded. "I brought the juice," he said. "From the office pantry. It was sealed. I hadn't opened it before bringing it home." "You are certain of that?" "Yes. And after you brought it, I gave it to Lydia," he said. "She poured it." Miss Marple studied his face. There was confusion there. Fatigue, certainly. But not fear. "And you drank it yourself?" she asked. "Of course," he said. "Why wouldn't I?" Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Quite so." As they left the room, Inspector Mallory closed his notebook slowly. "Well," he said, "we have suspicion, opportunity, and missing property. It seems a fairly straightforward case." Miss Marple did not immediately reply. Instead, she looked back once toward the corridor where the patients lay recovering. "Does it?" she said gently. The inspector glanced at her. "You disagree?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "I think," she said, "that when everyone drinks from the same table, and yet the truth does not sit comfortably with any one of them, we must look a little more carefully at what was shared and what was not." Inspector Mallory considered that in silence. And for the first time, the case did not seem quite so straightforward, after all. Write Chapter 4, only 900 words only, and with title, No Repetition. Chapter 4, A Visitor at the Cottage. 2 days later, Windermoor Cottage stood once again in quiet order. The fallen tray had been cleared, the glasses removed, and the faint, sticky stains polished from the floor. Curtains were drawn back to admit the pale afternoon light, and the rooms, though outwardly restored, carried an unmistakable sense of unease, as though the house itself had not yet quite forgotten what had occurred within it. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 3 o'clock. The lavender bushes lining the path stirred faintly in the breeze, and somewhere nearby a gate creaked gently. It was an ordinary village afternoon, and yet the stillness here felt different from the peaceful quiet of St. Mary Mead. It was a stillness that seemed to listen. Sophia received her in the drawing room. She looked tired, though composed, took her hands folded carefully in her lap as she sat near the window. "My dear Miss Marple," she said warmly, "how very kind of you to come again." Miss Marple smiled and took the offered chair. "I thought I should like to see how you were managing," she said. "After such an unpleasant experience, one is often left with more questions than answers." Sophia sighed softly. "That is exactly it. I feel quite unsettled. Harold is determined to treat it as a simple robbery, but I cannot help thinking—" She paused. "That it was something more deliberate?" Miss Marple suggested gently. Sophia gave a small nod. Before she could say more, the door opened. Lydia entered, accompanied by a young man. He was neatly dressed, his manner easy, and his expression carried a quiet confidence that might have passed unnoticed in less attentive company. He paused at the threshold, then stepped forward politely. "Good afternoon," he said. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," Sophia replied. "Miss Marple, this is Henry, a friend of Lydia's." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "How do you do?" Henry returned the gesture with a courteous smile. "I was very sorry to hear what happened here," he said. "I came to see if Lydia was quite all right." "That is most considerate," Miss Marple said. Lydia, standing beside him, seemed somewhat more at ease than she had been at the hospital. Her movements were less restless, though she still avoided meeting Miss Marple's gaze for more than a moment. "We are managing," Sophia said, "though the matter is far from settled." At that moment, another figure appeared in the doorway. Inspector Mallory entered, removing his hat. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hadley," he said. "I trust I am not interrupting." "Not at all, Inspector," Sophia replied. "We were just speaking of the matter." The inspector nodded, his eyes briefly noting the presence of Henry before turning his attention back to Sophia. "I have come to take a more detailed account of what is missing," he said, "and to ask a few additional questions." Sophia rose and moved toward a small writing desk. "I have prepared a list," she said, handing him a folded paper. "Jewellery mostly, and some cash." Inspector Mallory unfolded it and scanned the contents. "A considerable amount," he observed. "Yes," Sophia said quietly. "I had taken it from the locker only the day before." Miss Marple glanced at her. "You mentioned that to Lydia, I believe?" Sophia nodded. "Yes, Martha was present at the time as well." Inspector Mallory made a note. "And Mr. Edwin?" he asked. "Has he returned?" Sophia's expression clouded. "No," she said. "He left the hospital and has not come back since." The inspector looked up sharply. "Not at all?" "No." "That is unfortunate," he said. Harold's absence was also noted. "He's gone into town," Sophia explained. "He wishes to speak with the bank and make certain arrangements." "And Robert?" the inspector asked. "In his room," Sophia said. "He has been quiet since the incident." Miss Marple listened to all this without interruption, her gaze occasionally shifting, not to the speakers, but to the small details others might overlook. Henry stood near the mantel, his posture relaxed, though his eyes moved with quiet attention from one person to another. Lydia sat beside her mother, her hands folded tightly together. Inspector Mallory closed his notebook. "There is one more matter," he said. "The drink. We have confirmed that the substance used was a sedative, strong but not immediately harmful. However, there were also traces of something else." Sophia looked alarmed. "Poison?" "Not in a fatal sense," the inspector said, "but enough to suggest that the drink may have been altered more than once." Miss Marple's eyes rested briefly on Lydia. "That is most interesting," she said, softly. Henry spoke for the first time since the inspector's arrival. "Surely," he said, "if the drink was tampered with, the person responsible must be someone who had access to the table." Inspector Mallory looked at him. "And you are?" "Henry," he said, "a friend of Miss Lydia's." "I see." Henry smiled slightly. "It seems quite straightforward. Whoever served the drink would have had the opportunity." Lydia stiffened. "I only poured it," she said quickly. "Edwin brought it." The inspector raised a hand. "No one is being accused at present," he said calmly. Miss Marple, however, watched the exchange with quiet interest. "Opportunity," she said gently, "is a curious thing. It often appears simple at first, and then becomes rather less so upon closer inspection." Henry inclined his head politely. "Perhaps." Miss Marple rose after a few moments. "I think," she said, "that I should take a small walk through the house, if you do not mind." "Of course not," Sophia said. "You are always welcome." Miss Marple moved slowly through the hall, her steps light, her eyes attentive. The house was in order once more, but order, she knew, could sometimes conceal more than disorder ever revealed. She paused briefly at the foot of the stairs, then turned instead toward the dining room. The table had been cleared, but one detail caught her eye at once, a faint, ring-shaped mark upon the polished surface. She bent slightly, examining it. A glass had stood there, but not quite in line with the others, just a fraction apart. Miss Marple straightened slowly. "Curious," she murmured. As she made her way back toward the drawing room, She passed the small waste bin near Lydia's writing desk. Something within it drew her attention. A small cardboard box, partially open. She did not touch it. She merely looked. Then after a moment, she moved on. When she re-entered the drawing room, conversation ceased briefly. Inspector Mallory glanced at her. "Anything of interest?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only a few small things," she said. "Nothing definite?" "Not yet," she replied. She resumed her seat, her hands resting quietly in her lap, but her mind, as always, was not at rest. Pieces were beginning to take shape, not clearly, not completely, but enough to suggest that what had happened at Windermoor Cottage was not the work of a single careless act. It had been arranged, carefully, and somewhere within that careful arrangement, a small detail, almost too small to notice, was quietly waiting to reveal the truth. Chapter 5. The Absent Brother. 3 days passed before Inspector Mallory was able to locate Edwin Hadley. The discovery came not through clever deduction, but through the quiet persistence of village inquiry. A postman, recalling a familiar face, mentioned that Edwin had been seen in a neighbouring village, lodging, it seemed, in a small cottage at the far edge of a narrow lane. Miss Marple accompanied the inspector when he went to call. The cottage was modest and well kept, though there was a noticeable stillness about it, as if it had been chosen for its distance rather than its comfort. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, and the small garden at the front showed signs of recent attention. Inspector Mallory knocked. There was a pause, followed by the sound of measured footsteps within. The door opened. Edwin stood before them. He looked tired, more so than he had at the hospital, but his expression was composed. There was no sign of panic, no attempt to retreat or conceal anything. If anything, he seemed unsurprised. "I thought you might come," he said quietly. Inspector Mallory inclined his head. "May we come in, Mr. Edwin?" "Of course." He stepped aside and they entered. The room inside was simple but orderly. A small table stood near the window, a chair drawn close beside it. A kettle rested on the stove, and a folded coat lay across the back of another chair. There were few possessions and fewer signs of comfort. Miss Marple's eyes moved gently over the room, noting everything and touching nothing. Inspector Mallory began without delay. "You left the hospital without informing your family," he said. "That is rather unusual." Given the circumstances." Edwin nodded. "I needed time," he replied. "To think." "And to avoid questions?" the inspector suggested. Edwin gave a faint, tired smile. "Questions were inevitable," he said. "Avoiding them would have made little difference." Inspector Mallory took out his notebook. "We would like you to explain once again your part in the events of that evening." Edwin walked slowly to the table and picked up a small piece of paper. "I have already told you most of it," he said, "but I will repeat it if necessary." "That would be helpful," the inspector replied. Edwin handed over the paper. "A receipt," he said, "from the office pantry." Inspector Mallory examined it. "Field and Sons," he read, "Main Street, Market Town." "Yes," Edwin said, "that is where I have been working." Miss Marple looked at him quietly. "You mentioned this employment before," she said. "You had only recently begun." Edwin nodded. "A few days before the incident." "And the juice?" asked the inspector. "It came from there," Edwin replied. "Sealed. I had not opened it before bringing it home." Inspector Mallory looked up. "You are certain?" "Quite certain. And yet," the inspector said, "it was that very drink which rendered your entire household unconscious." Edwin did not flinch. "I am aware of that," he said. "But if I had intended such a thing, it would have been unwise to include myself." Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. "A most sensible observation," she said gently. Inspector Mallory closed his notebook slightly. You expect us to believe that you had no knowledge of what was in that bottle? Yes, Edwin said simply. And you gave it to Miss Lydia to serve? I placed it on the table, Edwin corrected. She poured it. There was a brief silence. Miss Marple stepped a little closer, her expression mild. You seem quite certain of your innocence, Mr. Edwin, she said. I am, he replied. She studied him for a moment. There was no hesitation in his tone, no flicker of fear in his eyes, only weariness and something else perhaps, a kind of quiet resignation. And this position, she continued, at Field and Sons, how did it come about? Edwin hesitated just slightly. I was introduced, he said, through a gentleman. What gentleman? Asked the inspector. Henry, Edwin replied. He said he knew of an opening, arranged for me to meet the owner. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her expression did not change. Henry, she repeated softly. Yes. Inspector Mallory made a note. And you trusted him? Edwin gave a faint shrug. He seemed reasonable. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Appearances can be very convincing, she said. Edwin met her gaze. Yes, he said quietly. They can. Inspector Mallory folded the receipt and placed it in his pocket. We shall be verifying this information, he said, and speaking to this Mr. Henry as well. Edwin nodded. I expected as much. There was no resistance in him, no urgency to defend himself further. It was, Miss Marple thought, the behaviour of a man who knew that truth would not be found in argument, but in patience. As they turned to leave, Miss Marple paused at the doorway. One more thing, Mr. Edwin, she said. He looked at her. You drank the juice, she said. Yes. And you finished it? As far as I remember. She inclined her head. Thank you. Outside, the afternoon air felt clearer. Inspector Mallory walked a few steps in silence before speaking. Well, he said, he's either very clever or entirely innocent. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. I should say, she replied thoughtfully, that he is neither as clever as all that, nor as guilty as he appears. The inspector glanced at her. You are certain? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I am never certain, she said. But I do find it difficult to believe that a man who includes himself so completely in danger is the one who arranged it. Inspector Mallory considered this as they walked. And this Henry? Miss Marple's eyes moved ahead, thoughtful. A most interesting connection, she said. There was a quiet pause. Then she added very gently, I think, Inspector, that we are beginning to see not just what happened, but how it was made to appear. And that, she knew, was often the first step toward understanding the truth. Chapter 6. A Quiet Observation. That same afternoon, after parting from Inspector Mallory, Miss Marple made her way once more toward Windermoor Cottage. The sky had grown softer, touched with a pale golden light that settled gently across the village lanes. A faint breeze stirred the hedges, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked briefly before falling silent again. It was a peaceful scene, too peaceful perhaps for a house in which something so deliberate had taken place. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts moving with equal care. There was, she felt, a pattern beginning to emerge, not a clear one yet, but something suggested by small inconsistencies, the kind of inconsistencies that did not announce themselves loudly but waited quietly to be noticed. Windermoor Cottage stood as before, and its ivy-covered walls catching the late light. Sophia opened the door. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, her voice tired but welcoming, "you must think us quite a troublesome household." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied kindly. "Merely interesting." Sophia gave a faint, uncertain smile. "Robert has not been himself," she said, as they moved into the drawing room. "He scarcely leaves his room. Ever since that night he seems withdrawn." Miss Marple nodded. "Such events affect people differently," she said gently. "Some grow restless, others very quiet." Sophia hesitated. "There is something else," she said. "Robert had 2 friends, young men from the neighbouring village. They were attacked 2 nights ago." Miss Marple paused slightly. "Attacked?" she repeated. "Yes, nothing too serious, but enough to frighten them. Robert was quite shaken when he heard." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "Indeed," she said softly. There was a connection there, she could feel it, but it was not yet clear. After a few moments, she rose. "May I speak with Lydia?" she asked. "Of course," Sophia replied. "She is in her room." Miss Marple moved quietly up the stairs, her steps light upon the carpet. Lydia's door stood slightly ajar. She was standing near her dressing table when Miss Marple entered, her reflection caught in the mirror. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Not directly, but through the glass. Then Lydia turned. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said quickly. "I didn't hear you." "No matter, my dear," Miss Marple said. "I hope I am not disturbing you." Not at all. There was a slight tension in Lydia's posture, though she tried to conceal it. Miss Marple moved a little further into the room. "I was thinking about the evening of the incident," she said gently. "You poured the drinks, did you not?" "Yes," Lydia replied at once. Her answer came quickly. Again, Miss Marple noted. "And the juice itself," Miss Marple continued. "You had no reason to suspect anything unusual." "No," Lydia said firmly. "Edwin brought it. I simply poured it into the glasses." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Quite understandable." She glanced briefly around the room. Everything appeared in order, neatly arranged, carefully kept. But order, she knew, could sometimes be more revealing than disorder. Her gaze fell, almost casually, toward the small waste bin beside the dressing table. Inside, something caught her attention. A small cardboard box, partially open. She did not move toward it. She did not touch it. She merely observed. Then, as though nothing had caught her interest at all, she turned back to Lydia. "Well," she said kindly, "I am sure everything will soon be made clear." Lydia gave a faint smile, though her hands remained tightly clasped. Miss Marple left the room quietly. Downstairs, she paused in the hallway for a moment, her thoughts settling into a clearer shape. Sleeping. That was the intention. Not harm, not at first. To make them sleep. To quiet the house. To leave it open. And then, something else. By the time she stepped back outside, the evening light had begun to fade. Later that night, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her chair with a cup of tea before her. Inspector Mallory arrived shortly after. "I have spoken with Henry," he said as he entered. "At his place of work." Miss Marple looked up. "And what did you make of him?" "A respectable young man," the inspector replied. "Polite, cooperative. He claims Edwin approached him for work, says he merely helped him secure a position." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Did he seem surprised by your questions?" "Not particularly," the inspector said. "He appeared composed." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. "Yes," she said. "I imagine he would." Inspector Mallory looked at her closely. "You do not trust him?" "I do not distrust him either," she replied mildly. "I simply find him interesting." There was a brief silence. "The sedative," the inspector continued. "It was certainly present in the drink, but the doctor maintains there were traces of something else, something added separately." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe that is quite correct." The inspector folded his arms. "And what do you make of it?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she looked toward the window where the last of the evening light had begun to fade into shadow. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone wished to ensure that everyone in that house would sleep." She paused. "And I think that someone else may have helped them, without quite understanding what they were helping to do." Inspector Mallory frowned. "You believe there were two people involved?" Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps only one. Who made use of another?" The inspector considered this. "And the purpose?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "To create silence," she said. There was a quiet pause, then she added very gently, "And once there is silence, one may move quite freely." Inspector Mallory nodded slowly. The pieces, though still incomplete, were beginning to form a clearer picture. And Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the fading light, knew that the truth was now very close, hidden not in what had been done openly, but in what had been done quietly, and almost without notice. Chapter 7. The Pattern Revealed. The following morning, Windermoor Cottage once again became the centre of quiet attention. Inspector Mallory had asked that everyone be present. There was no sense of urgency in his manner, but there was a firmness which suggested that matters were nearing a conclusion. The drawing room was arranged as it had been before, chairs drawn close, the curtains half open to admit the soft morning light. Yet the atmosphere was different now. There was a stillness, but not the uncertain kind of before. This was a waiting stillness. Sophia sat near the window, her hands folded, her expression composed but strained. Lydia sat beside her, unusually quiet. Harold stood near the mantel, his posture rigid, his impatience evident in every movement. Robert remained slightly apart, his gaze lowered, his shoulders tense. Edwin stood near the doorway, silent and withdrawn. And Henry, calm, well-dressed, composed, stood just within the room, as though he belonged there. Miss Marple sat in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Thank you all for gathering," he said. "We believe we are now in a position to understand what occurred on the night in question." Harold gave a short, impatient sound. "And by all means, Inspector, let us hear it. This has gone on quite long enough." Inspector Mallory inclined his head slightly. "Indeed, but before I speak, Miss Marple has asked to say a few words." All eyes turned toward her. Miss Marple looked around the room, her expression gentle, her voice calm. "It is often the case," she began, "that when something appears simple, it is only because we have not yet looked closely enough." She paused, her gaze resting briefly on each face. "In this case, we had several things placed before us. A household rendered unconscious, a quantity of jewellery and cash missing, and a drink which had clearly been tampered with." She folded her hands. At first, it seemed quite straightforward. One might suppose that the person who brought the drink was responsible. Harold nodded sharply. "Exactly." Miss Marple turned her head slightly toward him. "And yet," she said gently, "that same person drank from it as well." There was a brief silence. Edwin did not move. "It is possible, of course," Miss Marple continued, "for someone to take such a risk, but it is uncommon." Inspector Mallory nodded. "So we must look elsewhere," Miss Marple said. Her gaze shifted almost imperceptibly toward Lydia. "We know that the drink was served by Miss Lydia. She poured it into the glasses." Lydia stiffened slightly. "I only did what anyone would have done," she said quickly. There was nothing unusual. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. That is quite true. You did only what was expected of you. Her tone was kind, but her eyes remained thoughtful. And yet, she added, there was something else. She paused. A small thing, perhaps, but small things are often the most revealing. Inspector Mallory watched her closely. The doctor found evidence of a sedative, Miss Marple said. Something that would cause sleep, not harm, at least not immediately, but enough to ensure that no one would remain awake. She turned slightly, and I observed something else, a small box in Miss Lydia's room. Lydia's hands tightened. Miss Marple continued gently. A box of sleeping pills, partially used. Lydia shook her head quickly. I sometimes take them for sleep. Of course, Miss Marple said kindly. Many people do. There was a pause. But the question is not whether you possessed them, she continued, only whether they were used that evening. Silence settled over the room. Henry shifted slightly, though his expression remained composed. Miss Marple turned her attention toward him. And then there is the matter of opportunity, she said. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. We have established, he said, that Mr. Henry had contact with Mr. Edwin prior to the incident. He assisted him in securing employment. Henry inclined his head slightly. That is correct. Miss Marple nodded. A useful connection, she said. There was a faint pause, and one which provided access. The room grew still. Henry's expression did not change. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. It is sometimes the case that a person enters a household not by force, but by familiarity. She looked at him directly now, through friendship, through trust. Lydia's breath caught slightly. Henry remained silent. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. We have, then, several pieces, she said. A drink prepared, a sedative introduced, a household rendered silent. She paused. And a theft, which appears almost too convenient. Inspector Mallory looked around the room. You believe the theft was secondary? He asked. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I believe, she said gently, that it was intended to distract. There was a long silence. The pattern, though not yet fully spoken, had begun to take shape. And in that quiet room, each person felt in their own way that the truth was very near, waiting only for the final piece to be placed. Chapter 8. The Truth in Silence. For a moment after Miss Marple's last words, the room remained perfectly still. No one spoke. The quiet was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, expectant. Inspector Mallory glanced toward Miss Marple. I think, he said evenly, that we are ready to hear the full explanation. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she said, I believe we are. She folded her hands neatly and looked around the room, her gaze resting gently on each face before continuing. What happened at Windermoor Cottage, she began, was not the work of a single, simple action. It was arranged carefully so that it might appear simple. She paused briefly. The drink brought into the house was not, in itself, entirely dangerous. It contained only a very small trace of something unusual, nothing that would immediately cause harm. But it was not the true cause of what followed. Inspector Mallory nodded slowly. The true effect, Miss Marple continued, came from something added later. Her eyes moved almost kindly toward Lydia. My dear, you poured the drinks. Lydia's hands trembled. Yes, she whispered. And you were asked, Miss Marple said gently, to add something to them. Something harmless, you believed. Something that would simply make everyone sleep. Lydia's breath caught. I didn't mean, she began. Miss Marple raised a soft hand. I know, she said. You were told it was nothing serious, only a mild aid to rest, and you trusted the person who told you. A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek. I thought it would help, she said weakly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. You thought you were helping. She turned then slowly toward Henry. And that brings us, she said, to the person who arranged it. All eyes followed her. Henry stood very still. His expression remained calm, but only just. You entered this household not as a stranger, Miss Marple continued, but as a friend. You gained Lydia's trust. Through her, you gained access. Inspector Mallory stepped slightly closer. You also made contact with Edwin, he said, arranged his employment, ensured that he would bring something from outside into the house. Henry said nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but there was a quiet firmness in it now. The juice was prepared before it arrived, she said, not to harm, but to ensure confusion, and then through Lydia the final step was taken. She paused. A sleeping draught added to every glass. The room seemed to tighten. 5 people, Miss Marple said, all rendered unconscious at the same moment. A silent house. She looked at Henry. And in that silence, you were free to move. Inspector Mallory spoke. The jewellery, the cash. A distraction, Miss Marple replied. Something to draw attention away from the true intention. Henry's composure faltered. And what was the true intention? The inspector asked. Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. Revenge, she said. There was a long silence. Henry's shoulders dropped just slightly. My sister, he said at last, his voice low. They laughed at her, pushed her, near the river. She fell, and they ran. Robert flinched. You're lying, he said hoarsely. Henry's voice rose, sharp with emotion. They left her there. Silence followed. She died alone, he said, more quietly now. Miss Marple watched him with deep sadness. My dear boy, she said gently, what you felt was grief, but what you chose was something else. Henry closed his eyes briefly. I wanted them to feel fear, he said, to feel helpless. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. And so you poisoned them. No, Henry said quickly, and not to kill. Just to make them sleep. I only wanted to control what happened next, Miss Marple finished softly. Henry did not deny it. And Lydia? She asked gently. Henry's voice faltered. She trusted me. Lydia began to cry quietly. I didn't know, she said. I didn't know what you were doing. Miss Marple turned to her kindly. No, my dear, she said. You did not. Inspector Mallory reached into his pocket and took out a pair of handcuffs. Henry, he said firmly, you are under arrest for administering a harmful substance and theft. Henry did not resist. As the inspector stepped forward, Henry spoke once more. I wasn't alone, he said quietly. Miss Marple shook her head. No, she said gently. You were not alone. She paused. But the choice was yours. Henry lowered his head. The handcuffs closed with a soft, final sound. As he was led toward the door, the room seemed to exhale. Sophia covered her mouth with her hand. Harold stood in stunned silence. Robert sank slowly into a chair. Edwin turned toward the window, saying nothing. Lydia wept quietly. Miss Marple remained where she was. After a moment, she picked up her knitting. You see, she said softly, truth does not always arrive with noise. She glanced once toward the door, now closed again. Sometimes, she added, it waits quietly until someone is willing to notice the smallest things. Outside, the afternoon light rested gently upon the ivy-covered walls of Windermoor Cottage, and within, at last, the silence had been broken.
If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I'd love to know.